Somewhere in the final 10 minutes of Game of Thrones, a book gets placed on a table. Nobody in the scene reacts to it. The camera treats it like furniture. And yet that book might be the single most cynical detail the show ever included, and almost nobody clocked it in real time. The book is called A Song of Ice and Fire. It is supposed to be the official record of the war that just tore an entire continent apart. And the man who arguably saved the capital from annihilation is not in it. Not a mention. Not a footnote. Nothing. Most people who noticed this at all treated it as a cheap wink at the audience, a joke about the show finally naming its own source material. I think that reading undersells it badly. I think it is one of the coldest character payoffs in the entire series, and the setup for it was planted 6 seasons before anyone had a reason to remember it. Because this was never really a story about dragons and iron chairs. Underneath all of that, it is a story about who controls the record and what it costs to be indispensable while staying invisible. Rewind to the Battle of the Blackwater. Stannis Baratheon shows up with a fleet built to steamroll the capital. The boy on the throne, Joffrey, is spectacularly unsuited to command anything more demanding than cruelty. So the actual job of keeping the city standing falls to Tyrion, who is technically just filling in as Hand of the King while his father is away. What he does next is closer to a military case study than a lucky break. He rigs a single decoy ship with enough wildfire to level a harbor, lets it drift into the middle of Stannis' fleet, and lights it. In one stroke, most of an invading navy stops existing. In the books, there's an added detail the show trims out, a chain strung across the river mouth, sealing in the survivors so the fire has nowhere to escape them either. That is not improvisation. That is someone thinking 3 steps ahead of an enemy who is already inside the water. When the ground assault reaches the gates and the city's best-known fighter simply stops fighting, Tyrion puts on a helmet himself and leads the counterattack, badly outmatched, and nearly gets his face removed for the trouble. The city holds. Reinforcements arrive. Tyrion survives, barely, and the capital survives because of him. And then his father walks into the room where he is recovering, accepts the credit in front of the entire court, and has him quietly removed from the position he almost died defending. That is not a writing shortcut. That is the entire show compressed into one scene. Here is the moment that actually matters, and it is easy to miss because it plays so quietly. While Tyrion is still recovering, Varys visits him. Varys is the one character in this world whose entire skill set is understanding how power actually moves behind closed doors as opposed to how it looks from the outside. He does not offer comfort. He tells Tyrion something closer to an epitaph. Plenty of people in this city know the truth, that without him, the capital falls. But officially, none of that will exist. The king will not reward him. The history books will leave him out entirely. A handful of people will remember anyway, quietly, off the record. Strip away the phrasing, and what Varys is actually saying is this. Doing the right thing and being remembered for it are 2 completely separate transactions, and you do not get to assume you're getting paid in both currencies. You just won one and lost the other. That is not filler dialogue. That is close to a thesis statement for the whole series. Whoever ends up holding the throne controls the record, and the record tends to outlive the deed. You can save an entire city and still disappear from history, because history in this world is never written by the people doing the saving. It is written by whoever survives long enough to hold the pen afterward. Tyrion does not argue with any of this. He just takes it in, and once you know that conversation happened, a lot of his later behavior stops looking like a character quirk and starts looking like a strategy quietly being executed in real time. There's actually a second version of the same idea, years later, that most breakdowns skip entirely. Late in the show, Varys asks Tyrion to consider something. Maybe the best ruler is someone who does not actually want the job. At the time, it plays like political maneuvering against Daenerys. But it is the exact same argument from a different angle. Power that announces itself, that wants to be seen and credited, is fragile. Power that stays background, unclaimed, and unwritten is much harder to threaten. Here's something most retrospectives skip completely. The show and the novels are not quite describing the same man underneath the charm. On screen, Tyrion stays broadly sympathetic almost the entire way through. When he kills Shae, it plays as heartbreak curdling into violence. When he shoots his father minutes later, it plays as a final insult landing on a man who has been pushed past what a person can absorb. The novels go somewhere colder. Right before his escape, Tyrion's brother tells him a truth that had been buried for over a decade. His first wife, a woman he had genuinely loved and who had genuinely loved him back, was never what his father claimed she was. Tywin invented the lie out of contempt, then had her assaulted by his own men while forcing his son to watch, and let his son believe a lie about her for years afterward. George R. Martin has talked about this directly in interviews. Sometimes a person simply gets pushed past a point where there is no controlled response left, only a monstrous one, delivered without an apology attached. The show keeps the surface warmer. The underlying person was never really softer than that. This was always someone who understood that surviving a world built this way sometimes requires actions that a decent person is not supposed to be capable of. By the time the story ends, look at what Tyrion's real record actually contains. Convicted of murdering a king, personally responsible for killing his own father, serve a queen with dragons, then helped engineer her downfall by freeing his brother and talking someone else into finishing her off. Imprisoned, sentenced to death, and somehow he still walks out of all of it as Hand of the King, alive, sitting at the table, and completely missing from the official history of everything that just happened. Think about what that book would logically need to include. The Blackwater was one of the most consequential battles of the entire war, and its architect is absent from the account. A king's murder is the kind of thing that gets documented almost everywhere in history, real or fictional, and the convicted killer is nowhere in this one. That is not what an oversight looks like. That is what it looks like when a detail gets planted early and left alone for years to mature exactly on schedule. To understand why this isn't a coincidence, you have to go back to who Tyrion actually is underneath the one-liners. Jon Snow once asked him why he reads constantly. His answer, roughly, is that a mind needs books the way a blade needs a whetstone. That line is not a joke about being the smart one at dinner. He grew up watching his father build an entire empire mostly out of reputation. The Lannister name carried weight not because of gold alone, but because of a story everyone agreed to believe that crossing this family had consequences certain enough you never needed to actually witness them. Tywin says something close to this himself. A man who has to announce that he's in charge has already lost the argument. Real authority does not need to assert itself out loud. Tyrion absorbed that lesson completely, but he understood something his father never quite grasped. A complete, honest record of everything you have done is not an asset sitting in a vault. It is a weapon, and it is pointed at your own future. A truthful account of Tyrion's life reads like a list of capital offenses. That is not the resume of someone trying to help a fragile new government look legitimate. A Hand of the King who simply does not exist on paper leave his enemies nothing to point at. Near the end, there's a scene most people remember as clever political theater. It is also, quietly, a confession. Tyrion stands in front of the surviving lords and argues for electing Bran. He does not talk about armies or bloodlines. He talks about stories, and how nothing unites people the way a good one does, and how nothing beats it. The room hears a persuasive pitch. What is actually happening is a man stating his entire worldview out loud, in front of witnesses. He is not backing Bran because Bran would make the best administrator. He is backing him because Bran's story, a boy who fell an impossible distance and lived, who came back different, generates a kind of authority no treasury can purchase. If you genuinely believe a story is the strongest weapon available to anyone in power, the next move is obvious. Controlling your own story, or removing it from the record entirely, is not a side effect of that belief. It is the single smartest application of it. To be fair to the skeptics here, there is no scene of Tyrion drafting a letter demanding that certain chapters get quietly dropped. The show never confirms any of this outright, and treating a reading like this as confirmed fact rather than an interpretation would be dishonest. But look at the mechanics that are actually on screen. Tyrion becomes Hand the moment Bran is crowned, a position that controls the crown's resources and influence. The Citadel, the institution responsible for writing the official history, depends on staying useful to whoever currently holds power in the capital. That is not speculation. That is simply how institutions of that kind tend to behave in fiction and out of it. He also spends weeks in a cell before that election, doing essentially nothing but thinking. And in that exact same stretch of story, he talks an entire room of skeptical, battle-hardened lords into crowning a candidate none of them walked in planning to support. Convincing one historian to leave a name out of first draft is a considerably smaller lift than that. No threats required. Just letting an institution do what institutions have always done, which is defer to whoever is currently signing the checks. It's worth adding some outside context here, too. This exact mechanism of history being shaped by whoever survives to control the telling is not a one-off gag invented for the finale. George R. Martin's companion history of House Targaryen is deliberately structured as a single scholar compiling and weighing several contradictory eyewitness accounts, some more reliable than others, and choosing which version to lean on. The writers who adapted that material for television have said in interviews that the entire format is built around people describing events they did not personally witness, getting details wrong, and writing with an agenda whether or not they realize they're doing it. That is the exact same machinery sitting underneath the Tyrion detail. In this fictional world, history was never meant to be objective truth. It was always going to be shaped by whoever survived long enough to control the account afterward. Tyrion is simply the first character clever enough to use that fact on purpose instead of becoming a casualty of it. It's worth being upfront about why this detail slipped past so many people at the time. The final season had real, well-documented problems. A central villain's collapse that happened faster than the build-up supported it. A major battle shot dark enough that plenty of viewers genuinely could not follow the action. Once an audience stops trusting a production to be careful, it tends to stop looking for intention anywhere in it, including in a handful of places where the intention was actually there all along. Some critics at the time did read the book reveal as a groaning, self-satisfied wink rather than a real payoff, a show naming its own source material for applause. That's a fair reaction to have, especially in a finale that earned a lot of skepticism. But it also doesn't explain the six-season gap on its own. Varys plants that line in Season 2. The finale cashes it in 6 seasons later, in a completely different arc, after a coronation nobody could have predicted that far back. That kind of long-distance connective tissue is a harder thing to stumble into by accident than a single episode's worth of fan service would be. Step back and look at the full shape of this character. Raised being told he was an embarrassment his own family wished had never been born. Survived a trial that could have ended with his execution. Survived a blade across the face in the one battle nobody else in that city could win. Survived being condemned to death more than once. Survived betraying a queen who had every reason and every ability to burn him alive without a second thought. And he finishes the story as arguably the second most powerful man in the realm, quietly running the actual government behind a ruler most people will spend years underestimating, with his darkest chapters erased before anyone could ever use them against him. He did not just survive everything this world threw at him. He was playing a longer game than almost anyone left standing by the end. And the final, quietly ruthless move was making sure nobody would ever get to read the complete account of exactly how he pulled it off. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. Was this mapped out years ahead of time, the way the strongest long-form storytelling tends to work? Or did a rushed, uneven final season stumble into a detail that just happens to fit this well in hindsight? Honestly, both readings hold up, and that tension is probably exactly why people are still arguing about this scene years later. Drop your own read on in the comments, agree or disagree. I want to see the case for both sides. And if you want more of these, the details this show buried in plain sight that almost nobody was watching closely enough to catch, subscribe, and keep notifications on. There's a lot more here that hasn't been properly unpacked yet.